The Michael Berry Show.
I came across something I found to be very interesting by a fellow I did not know of before by the name of Dr. Joe Rigney. And he's a fellow of theology at New St. Andrews College and a pastor at Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. He's the author of 8 books, but what caught my attention is a book that he's published this year called The Sin of Empathy. And I saw that and I gave it a great deal of thought because it is, you've heard my theory on the naive neighbor, that our greatest challenge is not the people who want to destroy our society. There have always been those people. Our challenge is the naive neighbor who will allow the Trojan horse inside their home until it's too late to defend it. He's also written Leadership and Emotional Sabotage and more, 8 books, I believe, in total. And it seemed like a great person to have on our show. You know, I don't do very many guests, but when someone is proffering a theory or a position or an experience that I think is interesting to me, I share it with you. So, Joe Rigney, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So let's talk about the sin of empathy. You caught my attention. I have a naive neighbor theory that I posit often, and I think there probably at least some overlap in that Venn diagram.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It is a provocative title, so I'm glad it did catch your attention. And it's getting at the idea that virtues, when they become untethered and unmoored from truth and reality and what is good, become highly destructive. And we see this in a whole host of different ways. But I think that compassion, which is a virtue, something that modeled for us by Christ, it's core to the Christian faith, is a really glorious virtue. But one of the things I learned from C.S. Lewis many years ago is that when love becomes a god, meaning when a human love, a natural love becomes a god, it becomes a demon, and it destroys everything in its path. And Lewis, of course, illustrated this in a number of ways with things like mother love. We are all familiar with mother love is a good thing, but mother love can become possessive, suffocating. It can coddle. It can, rather than help people grow up, it can keep them in an infantile state. And so mother love, when it's not governed by what is true and good and right, becomes destructive. Lewis illustrated this in a number of different ways. What I began to see over the last 15 years or so, and I was helped in this by a number of other authors, was that compassion was undergoing the same kind of transformation. But the difference here was that compassion, people often presented a new word, a sort of upgraded compassion, which they called empathy. Empathy was supposed to be an improvement on the old Christian virtue of sympathy or compassion. And in the process, the way that it was described was a sort of total immersion in the feelings and pain and suffering of others. And the danger that I saw was if you do that, if you totally immerse yourself in the feelings and pains and sufferings of others, you can lose touch with reality. You can get swept off your feet. So I often use the illustration. If you see someone drowning in quicksand, apathy, which is a bad response, would just turn around and walk the other way, much like the guy in the Good Samaritan parable who walks along the other side of the road. The proper response is to reach in with one hand and hold on to them, and then hold on to the shore, grab a branch on the other side in order to help them get out of the pit. But what empathy demands is you need to jump in here with me. And now you have 2 people drowning.
Right. Joe Rigney, I am so glad you used that example because it is an example I don't claim, and it's been around for a long time, that I have used often and that I imagine of sometimes helping someone does not include sharing their heroin addiction or sharing the little bit of money you've saved with them so they can use it on their heroin addiction. You're helping both of you drown. I think that is such a perfect analogy, and analogies can be so incredibly powerful. Let me take a step back and ask you, as pastor at Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, and a fellow of theology at the New St. Andrews College, how did you get interested in this particular issue? Because so often members of the clergy preach that love will handle all, love will conquer all, just love, love, love. And this is I'm glad that you quoted C.S. Lewis, because I think that is a next level Christian author and his theology, which appeals a great deal to me. It's a very rational theology. and obviously he was such a proficient and wonderful writer. But talk to me about how you got into this.
Yeah, I was teaching classes on leadership at a Christian college, and I read a book by a Jewish rabbi named Edwin Friedman, a book called A Failure of Nerve. And he talked a lot of, it's the basis, it's one of the key themes in my book, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. I essentially plunder Friedman, among others, in order to put them in a more Christian framework and describe the challenges of leadership in our anxious, angsty, agitated world. But one of the dangers that Friedman highlighted in particular was the danger of empathy. And he noted this way that empathy often was a disguise. It became a power tool in the hands of the sensitive. That was his phrase, a power tool in the hands of the sensitive, where whole communities were expected to adapt to the most reactive, immature, and destructive members of the community. And if anyone said, I don't think this is a good idea, I don't think that we should be coddling this, or I think that that's an unacceptable way to behave, the person who was demanding responsibility was the person who would get policed by, in your phrase, the naive neighbors. The naive neighbors would actually exert the pressure on the people attempting to draw lines and boundaries rather than call the person who's immature and reactive to take responsibility for themselves. And he said that this was done under the banner of empathy. And I read that, found it helpful. And then it seemed to me that over the last, 10 or 15 years, American culture conspired to prove Friedman's point.
Hold right there. Let's get into examples. Coming up, Dr. Joe Rigney, the sin of empathy. Subject I'm quite interested in. Dr. Joe Rigney is our guest. He is the pastor at Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, author of 8 books. The one that caught my attention is The Sin of Empathy. And I think that we've seen that sin individually, and I think we've seen it writ large. The idea, I'm going to say things that he might not agree with. I'm going to offer my perspective. I'm not putting words in his mouth. I think the sin of empathy dragged us down the path of mass-scale illegal immigration. I think the sin of empathy dragged us into the Soros-owned district attorneys who were putting murderers back out on the street with a recognizance bond, and they're committing more murders. We've just seen this in Houston multiple times in the last month. They're committing more murders while they're waiting for the trial of their own, because we don't want to believe that people are bad. The sin of empathy, a lack of consequences, a lack of accountability. We see it in parenting, where you see parents that cannot tell their child no, parents that cannot say, you can't do this, or there are going to be consequences when you do this. We see the sin of empathy in saying that nobody should be fired, even if they show up drunk or do whatever else. I think this sin of empathy has overtaken our culture and made us a weak people and made us a vulnerable people. And I think that is very dangerous. Dr. Joe Rigney, I don't know how much, if any, of my examples you agree with, but I'd be curious to know.
Yes, I think you gave a number of very excellent examples in which maybe I would add a few. I think that the entire, what we now call wokeness, the entire diversity, equity, inclusion complex that sort of was institutionalized in American society basically gave us what I affectionately call the victimhood Olympics, where people began to compete to see who could be the greatest victim. Because under an empathetic mindset, an untethered empathy mindset, the greatest victim sets the agenda for the entire community. And everybody is expected to reorganize all of society around them. Of course, other examples would be things like Obergefell and the push for so-called gay marriage. And then now we've seen where that has led even farther into the trans movement, which demands that people's feelings can trump biological reality, and that all of society, they just passed a bill in Colorado, which ascribes penalties for those who would misgender someone, who would not use the preferred pronouns or the name that deranged individuals want to use, and that they intend to use to catechize and groom vulnerable children into castrating themselves. So all of this kind of demented mentality was enabled and empowered by this untethered empathy. And it did so, I'll quote C.S. Lewis once again, Lewis, and this applies, I think, to a number of the examples you gave about progressive cities and the way that they empathy for criminals trumped safety for citizens and illegal immigration. Lewis once wrote that mercy, this is a similar principle, mercy detached from justice grows unmerciful. It's a paradox because he says, as there are certain plants which flourish only in mountain soil, mercy will flower only when it grows in the crannies of the rock of justice. When you transplant it to the marshlands of humanitarianism, it becomes a man-eating weed, and it's all the more dangerous because it's still called by the name of the mountain variety.
That's right.
So when mercy is detached from justice, everybody says, isn't mercy a great thing? And you want to say, of course it does. Of course it is. The Bible teaches mercy everywhere. God is merciful and gracious to us. But his mercy is tethered to his justice. His mercy and justice meet together, in fact, in the cross of Jesus Christ. But
well, and if I may interject
from justice,
if I may interject, the great economist and philosopher, the Scotsman who in 1776 wrote *The Wealth of Nations*, famously said, "Mercy to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent." So mercy without consequences is cruelty to the innocent, and I've seen that happen so many times. I love what you're talking about. This is fantastic. Keep going. I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. And so Lewis's notion, though, is that mercy, when it's detached from justice, grows unmerciful because it becomes this man-eating and destructive weed, and people don't recognize it. Your naive neighbor thinks, oh, this is just mercy. I'm called to be merciful. The Bible tells me to be merciful, and it does. But the biblical mercy has hard edges. It's anchored in what is true and what is good. It's anchored to God. This was Lewis's entire point, saying when our passions, when our emotions are in submission to God, when they obey God, they're good. They help human beings to flourish. But when we cut them off from God, when we cut them off from reality, they become highly destructive, and we're swept away by our passions. And one of the ironic things I think that people don't appreciate, you'll hear people these days say things like, we live in such a cruel age. There's cruelty everywhere. And they say we need more empathy. And I actually want to argue, and I think there's other social scientists are actually bearing this out regularly, that it's actually the most empathetic who are the most cruel. And again, Lewis was helpful for me to understand this. He again wrote that a good emotion like pity, if not controlled by charity and the moral law, by charity and justice, he says, leads through anger to cruelty. And if you think about it, you can think about the way that pity, say for the so-called oppressed classes, leads by a very natural process to a reign of terror. You have pity for this group, and therefore you hate their oppressors. And their oppressors may be real oppressors, or they may be so-called alleged oppressors. But it's amazing how much cruelty you can do in the name of pity, empathy, and compassion, because your emotions are in the driver's seat. They are the thing that is leading the way rather than what is true and what is good and what is right.
I like it. I like it a great deal. How do you think we got into this state? Do you think people just really wanted to do the right thing and they lost touch that the right thing is not always the easy thing? Because I often say of parenting, when we have to make a tough decision with our kids, and it's silly little things, we have to give up your phone at a certain hour every night. It's a different hour for each of the kids, and sometimes one or the other, wouldn't like it. And my wife would say, it really, I think he feels like we don't trust him. And I would say, love, if being a good parent was easy, everybody would do it. You're sticking to the rules. Now he's handing over the phone. And I think that's part of it. To me, I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Well, for one, pity parties are as old as dirt. I think that Adam and Eve coming out of that garden immediately sought to manipulate each other by pity. And anybody who's been on the receiving end of a guilt trip knows the temptation of the sin of empathy, where you're tempted because someone is putting on a sad face or pretending to be a martyr to indulge them and coddle them and refuse to call them to take responsibility for themselves. So this is a universal human phenomenon. What's different is that in a Christian society, I think that people discovered it was a very potent weapon to get their way. It became a very palpable tool of social manipulation, and then it was institutionalized, I think, particularly by the left. Because compassion, at least in our society, is what you might call a left-coded virtue. It's one that people associate with us. So what they did was they were able to define a good biblical virtue, but use their own definitions. To be empathetic or compassionate to someone means that you must affirm everything that they think. You must agree with everything that they say. You can't question or challenge them
Right.
based on any moral standards. So it was an emotion that was detached from a moral framework, and then certain groups were elevated as worthy objects of compassion, and other groups were ignored. That's one of the other things about.
Hold right there. We're gonna discuss that with Dr.
Yeah.
Joe Rigney coming up. The Sin of Empathy. We'll get to his next book after that. Leadership and Emotional Sabotage.
Yeah. So one of the things about untethered empathy, when it's an excessive empathy, is it becomes highly myopic. Certain groups are judged to be worthy of empathy. So you can think about the way that over the last 10 or 15 years, so-called oppressed groups, whether it's minorities or the LGBTQ or illegal immigrants, compassion for them demands that we reorganize society around their felt needs and desires and agendas. Whereas others who may be equally suffering can be safely ignored. This is because empathy acts like a spotlight. It highlights certain people rather than others. And I think a clear example of this often shows up in our debates about abortion. So frequently, the way that abortion is justified is compassion or empathy for a woman in desperate circumstances. Maybe she's poor, maybe she's single or she's unmarried, or maybe in the worst case scenarios, you see political advertisements to this effect, say she was raped. And therefore, she's put forward as an object of compassion and empathy. And if she was raped, she absolutely is. But what gets lost is compassion for her means that we are now free to terminate her unplanned pregnancy or to terminate a fetus, which is a dehumanizing way to refer to her unborn child. And so compassion for her means indifference and even cruelty to her unborn child because our empathy becomes myopic. We focus only on one person rather than the needs of all. In fact, we frequently will focus on the immediate feelings of the person who's hurting rather than their long-term good. And again, the trans movement provides a perfect example. I have no doubt that someone who feels that they are in the wrong body undergoes a lot of psychological distress, emotional distress, and I would like to help them. But it does not help them to castrate them or to mutilate them or to put them on puberty blockers. That's not the way to help, but it's an attempt to relieve what they say is their immediate feelings rather than looking at their long-term good and the good of society. And so I think these are different ways that empathy kind of narrows our focus. It becomes myopic and therefore enables us to do things that are highly, highly destructive.
What's the answer to that? In short, what is the answer writ large? Not just for, I guess we're a collection of individuals, but how do we change this?
Yeah, I think one of the ways is you must, all of your emotions must become obedient. We know this with every other emotion. Everybody knows that if you let your anger guide you in every decision, that you're probably going to be led into some pretty bad places. If you let your desires, say your sexual desires, lead you, and they lead the way, you're going to be led to some pretty dark places. The same thing is true here. Our emotions must be tethered to what is true. They have to be on a leash. And they need to be, and I think, and I'm a Christian, I think they need to be tethered to Christ. I think Christ must be the anchor for all of our emotions. And when he is, we're actually freed to use them in the way that God intended us to use them. Our compassion becomes in service of people's ultimate good, and therefore we're able to act wisely and to actually help relieve the problems rather than simply make them worse by emoting into them. And so tethering our compassion, anchoring it to what is true and what is good, having them be governed by our reason and not let loose, that would be the fundamental thing that all of us should do as individuals and in our homes, as you're talking about with parenting, but also that we should expect as we form our nation's laws and seek to the good of society.
It's interesting because it's not all butterflies and rainbows. It's tough decisions with consequences, whether that's being a pastor of a church or the head of household or a parent in the household or a teacher or a coach. It's not all just, compliments and kindness. There has to be reasoned, difficult decisions and conversations, and we want it to be so easy. We want it to. I see parents who I think are raising little terrors because their child can never do anything wrong. Their child is so wonderful. And then when the child does begin acting out and finding there are guardrails in society, the child has, it's the officer's fault. It's the teacher's fault. It's always someone else's fault because their child is such an angel. And I think to myself, you are setting your child up for incredible failure and suffering by doing this. It's so easy to do, but we talked about the sin of love, and you mentioned mother love at the very beginning of the show. And I see it by people with the best of intentions. I see it all the time.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely right. And actually, those examples you just gave come up quite nicely in Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, the other book that you mentioned. Because
well, then why don't you finish this answer and we'll pivot to that?
Yeah, let's do that. So in that book, I'm talking about the sort of agitation and angst that we see around us, the sense that our culture is sitting on a powder keg, that there's this gas in the air and somebody's going to light a match and the whole thing is going to blow up. And we know that our social media amplifies this, but there seems like there's something deeply volatile in our society. And what I argue in the book is this is the result of a failure of nerve, an abdication among leaders. And I actually draw this back. In fact, the examples you were using just then mirror very well the fundamental story in the Bible in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam and Eve rebel against God, because there's a sort of three-step process that they go through as they move from a situation of paradise to being kicked out of God's sanctuary. And it begins with abdication. Adam was charged to guard this garden. That was the task that God gave to him. And instead of guarding it from this serpent who is blaspheming his God and questioning his wife, Adam remains silent. He's passive, he abdicates, and he lets the serpent lead the way. And then when he's faced with a moment of choice, that abdication leads him to rebel. He seizes the fruit that he was told not to eat from. He listens to the voice of his wife who offers it to him. He chooses her over God. The Bible's term for this is idolatry. So his abdication and passivity lead to idolatry. But then when he's called to account, when God comes and says, "What have you done?" Adam immediately points fingers at other people. He says, "The woman that you gave me." And I think this is somewhat comical because there are three people in existence at this point. There's God, Adam, and Eve. And Adam's position is, it's everybody's fault but mine.